To register black voters will begin in Selma, Alabama. In that city, there were 15,000 black people. You know how many were voting, registered to vote? Virtually zero. I'm sure there were a few, but virtually zero black voters in Selma. 15,000 blacks lived in Selma, Alabama. Virtually none had registered to vote. None. Well, because of his concern about violence, etc., on people registering to vote, he announces that he's going to have a march for freedom. Because what do you think happened when Martin Luther King Jr. and his followers got to Selma? Selma's Sheriff Jim Clark handled those protesters with brute force and violence. Beat the hell out of them, for lack of a better term. And Martin Luther King didn't like that either. So he said, you know what? To protest the treatment of our civil rights workers and to protest the fact that no one is registered to vote in Selma, we are going to lead a peaceful march from Selma, Alabama to the state capitol in Montgomery, Alabama, which was 54 miles away. Okay? So Martin Luther King comes into Selma, Alabama with the idea he's going to register those 15,000 Negroes that have not registered to vote. He and his civil rights workers are met with violence from Sheriff Jim Clark and law enforcement, who basically beat the tar out of him. He then reorganizes the civil rights workers into a march that he's proclaiming will happen from Selma, Alabama, all the way to the state capitol at Montgomery, Alabama, which is 54 miles away. Everybody following me on that? Interesting story how this works. Well, on March 7th of 1965, approximately 600 civil rights demonstrators left Selma toward Montgomery without Dr. King. On March 7th, 1965, approximately 600 civil rights demonstrators left Selma on their way to Montgomery without Dr. King. Why did Dr. King not go with those 600 protesters?
Were they a violent protest?
No, good guess. What'd you say?
Were they a violent protest? One of the other leaders' protest groups?
No, your violence has something to do with it. They were afraid for whose safety? King's. They were afraid if he led the march that he may be, hurt badly or killed. So they decided to march without him. So again, for his safety in question, those close to him did not want him to lead the march. Well, the name of the bridge out of town at Selma to get out of town towards Montgomery was the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You had to cross that bridge to kind of get out of town so you could get to Montgomery. The Edmund Pettus Bridge was the bridge that got you out of town towards Montgomery. Well, these 600 demonstrators didn't make it very far because they were stopped at the Edmund Pettus Bridge by state troopers, highway patrol, basically. So they marched from wherever they were in the city. They got only to the bridge, which takes you out of town. And they were stopped by state troopers. Well, these 600 protesters were beaten in an event that turned out to be the bloodiest of the civil rights movement up to that time. So they marched, heading for Montgomery. They are met at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and those protesters were beaten in an event that turned out to be the bloodiest of the civil rights movement to that time. And guess where everybody saw that? National television, broadcast live on national television. It was aired that evening, not live, but it was aired that evening on national television. Well, what do you think Dr. King's reaction was to that? We'll forget it. No. He was very concerned about the violence. and he immediately planned to do it again, to march again. We're going to try it again. We're going to go from Selma to Montgomery. We're not going to let these violent law enforcement stop us. Well, guess what the federal government got so they wouldn't march? Because they didn't want any more bad publicity on a beating. What do you get?
A wall.
Well, close. A federal injunction. So the march was barred by a federal injunction. An injunction's a ruling that can be made whether you can do this or do that. Okay? So the march was barred by a federal injunction, and basically that's a temporary stoppage until you can get a ruling by a court on whether they can go or not. So in a way it was kind of smart because they're not going to beat them up again and get bad publicity. They just go get a federal injunction, which is basically a stoppage until a judge can rule on whether they have the right to march from Selma to Montgomery or not. So we're at a standstill. They can't march yet, supposedly, because of the injunction. Well, despite that injunction, Dr. King led another march. This time there were 2,000 demonstrators. So despite the injunction, Dr. King led a march of nearly 2,000 supporters. They leave Selma, and again when they approach the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Dr. King had them all get down on their knees and pray. Okay, so they left again from Selma. They got to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Despite the injunction, when they got there, not knowing what was going to happen, Dr. King asked the 2,000 to kneel in prayer at the bridge. What do you think those people thought they were going to do after the prayer? Continue on, right? Well, to the surprise of those 2,000 supporters, King simply turned around and marched back into Selma. Why did he do that? He was going to get both sides. He was going to show that they weren't afraid, but yet he wasn't really going to go against what?
The law.
The injunction, the law. He was going to wait to see how the ruling went. Okay? Well, it took 2 weeks for that ruling to come back. 2 weeks. And the judge ordered that the injunction be lifted. And these people had the right to peacefully march from Selma to Montgomery. So King was smart there. Guess who talked him into not actually crossing Edmund Pettus Bridge on the second attempt? Guess who he had a conversation with? President Johnson said, please do not do this. It's just going to result in bad. Well, to get his point across, he did march him from Selma to the bridge. Didn't tell his supporters, 2,000. Knelt and prayed, got up and walked back, and waited for a legal ruling, which was probably smart and saved a lot of violence. Well, after the injunction was lifted, President Johnson called units of the Alabama National Guard and federal marshals and the FBI into Alabama to make sure that these protesters were treated right and were able to make their march. He was a little nervous about what was going to happen. So again, after the injunction was lifted, President Johnson called units of the Alabama National Guard, called in federal marshals, and called in the FBI into service, sent them to Alabama to monitor this march from Selma to Montgomery. This is incredible from this point on. So, on March 21st of 1965, what?
That's my birthday.
There you go. On March 21st of 1965, the Great March from Selma to Montgomery began again. This time, King had 3,000 followers. So you can remember that on your birthday what happened, the Great March from Selma to Montgomery. Now, as they marched from Selma, the 54 miles to Montgomery, Alabama, the marchers were under the protection of those federal marshals and the National Guard and the FBI protected them. It took them 5 days to march from Selma to Montgomery. 5 days. And in 5 days, they arrived at the steps of the state capitol. You know how many people were there to greet them? 25,000 people in support of King, and his marchers were at the state capitol when they arrived. So after 5 days of marching, Dr. King and his followers arrive at the steps of the state capitol in Montgomery. There's a crowd of nearly 25,000 people there to greet them. What do you think Congress did shortly after this historic march? Passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which guaranteed the rights of all people in the United States to register to vote. So after this successful march by Martin Luther King Jr. and his followers from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Congress passed, with the president's urging, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which ensured anyone that wanted to vote would have hassle-free clearance to register. Now, I will tell you, even though the act was passed, it made a little difference, but it isn't like every black in the Deep South went and registered, because they still had the pressures that we were talking about. Okay? Okay, I want to tell you now about two riots, two really bad riots that took place in America during the Johnson administration. Two riots. Maybe you've heard of these. The first one happened in a suburb of Los Angeles called Watts. A suburb of Los Angeles called Watts. And what happened is a black ghetto in Los Angeles, or community called Watts, had a riot that lasted 5 days and resulted in over 13,000 National Guardsmen being called in to get the situation under control. So the first major riot during the presidency of Lyndon Johnson took place in the black community of Watts, which is basically a black ghetto in Los Angeles. And the riots in Watts lasted 5 days and resulted in 13,000 National Guardsmen being called to get the situation under control. Now I'm going to give you 7 examples of how bad this was, the damage from this riot. 7 examples from damage from the Watts riot. Your first thought would be, how many people? 34. 34 people were killed in the Watts riot, the 5 days of rioting. 34 people.
Just blacks?
Mostly. Yeah. What else might want you to know about people?
Injured.
How many were injured? About 900 were injured. 34 killed, 900 injured. What else might you want to know about people? How many were what? Arrested. Very good. Over 4,000. So 34 people killed, 900 people injured or hurt, and over 4,000 people arrested. That'd keep your police department. I don't know, that'd be interesting. Now, it was really sad because a riot is bad. 209 buildings in Watts were completely gutted by fire. 209 buildings completely gutted. Fires, yeah. Great, I'm going to get to that because it's kind of interesting. I'll get to that. 787 other buildings suffered damage in Watts. 787 other buildings suffered damage. What about all those stores in Watts? What happened to all those? Got looted, robbed, yeah. Broke out the windows and took stuff. It's horrible. Horrible riot. And they said that the property loss in 1965 at the Watts riot was $46 million. That'd be about $330 million today. $46 million worth of damage in the black community of Watts, which would be about $331 million today. What happened, my dear? It's a good question because it happened later in history too, in the 80s.
No,
What?
my mom remembered that one. Wasn't it another one that took place in LA or like?
When Watts,
Yeah.
same place. Anyway, the first time a Negro boy was drunk, okay? And he was kind of goofy, and the police were there to arrest him. Well, you know, leave him alone. Come on, you know, white police. Well, pretty soon they didn't like the fact they were taking him to jail, so they threw rocks at the police, which turned into bottles, which turned into retaliation, which turned into unbelievable riot. But it all started from one drunk, you know, Negro who was kind of resisting arrest. Okay? Now, don't write this down, but in the 1980s, a guy by the name of Rodney King was in the same boat, all drunked up, and he was giving the police some trouble, and they beat the devil out of him with clubs, and somebody caught it on video. Didn't have phones in those days, but people had video recorders, you know, the great big ones, you know, they're videoing, and they caught it, and guess where it got to? The media. And the police took all kinds of heat, and it led to a huge riot in Watts. So we had a Watts 1, really, and a Watts 2. But that was in the 1980s with Rodney King. Okay? Now, the other major riot took place in Detroit, Michigan. Detroit, Michigan. And we'll tell you a little bit more about it tomorrow because it was much bigger and a bigger deal than the Watts riot. It was really kind of crazy, to be quite honest with you. And we'll tell you a little bit about it. Now, I want to ask you a question, though, Ms. Cottrell. Can you guess who the governor of Michigan was during the Detroit riots? George Romney. George Romney. Okay? Mitt Romney's father was the governor of Michigan during the Watts riot. We'll tell you a little bit about that tomorrow. That was kind of ugly, too. Okay? All right, we're doing good.